I think one of the issues that we need to do when we're talking about collection maintenance is why we do it. In library, primarily, the purpose of collection maintenance is to make the materials available and usable for the user in a library. That's primarily the reason for binding. A library likes to maintain a core collection by replacing titles. There is some thought there about whether a book should be replaced or not, but they like to replace things. Purpose of weeding in a library is to keep collections up to date. Depends on the nature of your library. Some libraries like to be an archive of published materials. Some libraries like to be on the cutting edge, and they say only the current thing, the most up-to-date thing. And so that may be a possibility for weeding. And preservation is often not used the same way in libraries as they are in archives and museums. In other words, the preservation idea is to, again, make the collection usable, to circulate and put them on the shelves. In a library, the collection management and care policies, you need to specify the kinds of things that you're going to bind. You're going to need to specify in your policy what your levels of preservation are. You need to specify what you're going to replace and weeding, and also who is responsible for those kinds of decisions. Do you have a committee? Do you have an individual person? I have a picture up there of some of the items in our rare book collection at the university that have come to me. And most of the items there originally were in the circulating collection, and so they had call numbers affixed to them, and one book was even repaired by sticky mystic tape, which libraries love to use, and archivists hate like the devil. And in some cases, we can take a book and we can wrap like you see when there was a piece of paper around it, kind of protecting the book. So we have a little different way in library. You need to specify in your policy. You can list specific steps and standards, but you can relegate those to task manuals or working manuals. How are we going to step by step of how we're going to handle something? And library policies tend to change very rapidly on collection management, mainly because of the effects of the internet and also the availability of electronic tech. There are a lot of libraries now who are subscribing to databases of books, and that is driving their collection development strategy and also driving whether they keep what they presently have. Archives, however, is a little bit different, and we follow more along the lines of museums, and that is collection care, in our instance, is foremost the preservation of the material, but not necessarily for the user. And like a museum, most of our materials are unique. They're one of a kind. They're manuscripts. They're documents. They're rare books. They may be limited edition. They may be autographed. Collection care also involves, in our case, issues of security, temperature and humidity control, use of acid-free storage containers. You're going to hear other museum people today talk about those same kind of standards for taking care of your collection. And those were all going to be considerations in what you're doing. In archive, we generally don't do binding. Binding is not done because we believe it alters the physical characteristics of the original material. We will look for alternative binding if we can. We will essentially leave the collection alone. It's like watching the Antique Roadshow and somebody have a beautiful piece of furniture, but they stripped all the original paint off of it and they replaced all the hardware, but by golly, it's the same thing as it was, and you lose all the patina of that. I have a collection here on a shelf called the Francisco Moreno Book Collection, which is a library of a gentleman in Pensacola in the 1830s and 40s. It came down intact in the family. We chose to keep it intact. This exhibit draws more eyes in my department for tours than anything else because it just catches people's eye, and then we can talk about the effects of Florida humidity on bindings and bugs and attacking leather and other kinds of things. Replacement in archive, replacement is generally not considered. Most items are unique. We will limit replacement sometimes to the best copy. In other words, somebody brings us in like we have a copy of something, somebody brings us in a second copy and it might be in better shape. We might replace it, or we might hold on to it, and the original be used. One might be used for an exhibit, for example, or other kinds of things. I have an example here from your book, The Life of Andrew Jackson by Parton, and I have several editions of this. one edition came to me, and it was all perfectly rebound in the traditional library orange binding, and the other set we maintained and kept intact. You can't see on it that the titles on one of those books have been covered over by clear tape. So whatever standards you implement in your library, you have to make sure that they follow through. Weeding is generally only done in an archive for things that either are not needed for the collection or oftentimes duplicate. We get a lot of personal papers of individuals and families and organizations. And in every case, somebody has 4 or 5 copies of the item. Board of directors, your secretary makes 15 copies. 7 people attended the meeting, but my God, you kept all 8 other copies in your file. But we end up going through and doing that kind of weeding. You can see there, some of our weeding goes into recycling, some of it goes into trash. We also have an aspect in archive that's helpful for us, and that is we have a nationwide listserv of archivists, and we have a standard thing called Free to a Good Home. And so if we come across something we feel is historically or important, we will offer it to another archive as a free to a good home and kind of help build their collection. I've gotten some fantastic things from other libraries that way. I've also shared things with them in that manner too. In preservation, archives are very similar to museums. The first best option for an item might not be do anything to it. It might just need careful storage, cleaning, restoration. Again, is kind of maybe repairs on it, some kind of treatment, encapsulation, deacidification. I don't recommend deacidification for places that are not used to that because those chemicals are carcinogenic. They're alcohol-based. They can be absorbed through the skin. I don't generally recommend those unless a person who's had a great deal of training. I don't let students do that kind of work. But preservation is similar to museums. In museums, of course, you're going to have other kinds of ways of treating metal and wood and other kinds of things. In archive, our treatment tends to be dealing with paper, bound materials, sometimes magnetic recordings, records, and that kind of thing. Another thing in our policy is disaster preparedness, and sometimes you can mitigate that by the way you store the collection. You can mitigate disaster by maybe scanning, copying the information. You have to sometimes ask yourself whether what's important is whether it's the item or the information on the item. And you have to think of that. There may be ways of sharing the collection, off-site storage. Every archive should have a disaster plan and emergency planning, and we talked about that last year during our previous workshop. In terms of standards of care in an archive, generally we have those kind of policies committed to paper. In our case, in most archives, standards of care, accessioning. I don't show accessioning forms here, but accessioning can be all of your documentation about how you got the material, whether there's a transfer agreement between the donor and your institution that specifies such things like you're transferring the property, maybe the transfer of copyright, maybe how the collection is to be stored or to be used or some other aspect. That's part of accessioning. Accessioning also represents a contract between you and the donor, and so you have to look at those very carefully. You may want to specify in your policy some kind of a review process for donations of materials which are a little outside of the norm, for example, or whether the donor has requested a certain aspect. We also, in terms of our standards, in our case, in our archive, we use a software package called Archon, which produces what's called an encoded archival description, and also a MARC record. You may want to specify those kind of standards of care in your policy about how you're going to deal with something. We also use Describing Archive, which is a Saudi American archivist teaching manual for describing archival materials in terms of the vocabulary used and the meaning of those kinds of words. But that may be part of your standards as well. The other thing I'll add to that is that depending on your setting, your collection care, your collection management may vary depending on what part of your collection you're dealing with. In other words, your standards of care and your collection management and care policies may, if you're in a museum, you may have a museum section. You might have an archive section, for example. You might have a library. A lot of museums do have a library. Sometimes the library is just a reference library, and that may not be crucial. But in other places, depending on the museum setting, your library could qualify as a rare book library. You could be accepting material catalogs of furniture makers and companies and different kinds of things that go back several hundred years, and so you may have to create standards of care for those kinds of things as well. This is a very quick overview and a very rough overview, but I think archives, I think, in this setting are a lot more like museums because our materials are unique. They tend to be one of a kind. Archivists see themselves as custodians of the past for the future. And by that I mean a lot of times we are looking at something not to make it, say, accessible today, to make sure it's here and accessible tomorrow and 100 years from now and into the future. In our policies, we try to, I've used the term in perpetuity, which my bosses in the library kind of shudder at because libraries don't see themselves as going that far into the future. I don't use the word eternity because that scares them even more. But I will say long-range care and treatment, long-range storage, and that's an acceptable term. But whatever you do, you have to make sure that your policies at least address some of these points, and they can be fleshed out in additional manuals or steps or other kinds of things, all of them dependent on your own particular institution and arrangement. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Kate McEwen, and I'm the collections manager for the Tribal Historic Preservation Office with the Seminole Tribe of Florida. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to be discussing collections, maintenance, and care from a museum point of view. And these four main areas that I'm going to address. And I'm sure most of it will be a review for a lot of you, but hopefully serve as a good refresher. And if you are in the process of creating a collection management policy from scratch or revamping your current policy, hopefully it will get you thinking about the types of collection care and standards that you should have in place. So the first area I'd like to speak on is collection roles. And I think this is something that's important that should be outlined in your collection management policy in terms of identifying the responsibilities for collections care. And it's going to differ depending on the size of your institution. If you're in a smaller institution, you may be the collections manager and the registrar and the curator of collections. And so outlining those responsibilities in your plan is important, not only for yourself, but also for your constituency and for your board of directors, so that everybody's on the same page and knows what your role and responsibilities are. Preventative care, or preventative conservation, is really one of those foundational blocks to good collections care. And the Getty Conservation Institute defines it as the management of the environmental conditions under which collections are housed and used. And those environmental conditions are what we're trying to have control over to create that stable environment for our collections. And they're often referred to as agents of deterioration. And once you identify which agents your collections are at risk to, it's important to mitigate, reduce, and to block those agents. And laying that out in your policy will help. And so I'm just going to very quickly go over these 10. And, you could spend hours on each one, but we'll go through quickly. And as I go through each slide, really think about how you can incorporate these into your own policy. So the first is physical forces. And this can be either direct or indirect, and could include, something as simple as dropping an object, or perhaps your museum is located very close to a highway, and you have those vibrations of a very busy highway that's affecting your collection. Those are all things that should be considered, and how you'll want to prevent any physical forces for damaging your collection. The next is thieves and vandals. No museum is really immune to this, and it's important to address the type of security that you have in your collection. Do you have guards in place? Do you use keys? Do you have restricted areas? If you have restricted areas and you have a researcher come in, do you have a staff person monitoring that person at all times? Really doing a risk assessment and identifying which types of collections might be more vulnerable than others can all be addressed in your policy. The next is disassociation, and while this isn't necessarily affecting the physical properties of an object, it can affect the legal, intellectual, or cultural aspects of an object, including loss of data, loss of objects, or object value. And the photo that I have on the side here, it's the same object, but it's been flipped upside down, and now you have a completely different number, a catalog number. So how are you going to prevent things like that from happening? And it can also be as complicated as, how are you going to migrate electronic data to new formats? And I think that's something that a lot of us are coming upon as technology advances so quickly. How are we going to prevent any loss of information within our databases? Fire. Again, no institution is really immune to this agent of deterioration, and most museums and archives really provide an abundance of fuel for a fire. And understanding what your fire suppression system is in place, how you can eliminate fuel for a fire, and not only protecting your collections, but also the people who are visiting your museum and your staff. Water can also be a natural occurrence or a mechanical failure. And the majority of water-related problems in cultural institutions are the result of accidents and neglect. So it's important to figure out strategies on how you can protect your collections from water damage. Do you have standards in place where everything has to be stored, 6 inches off of the ground in storage areas? If there's any sort of maintenance going on in your building, are you going to require that a collection staff person monitor someone working on the pipes in your museum? Pests. This can be categorized in 2 ways, non-pest organisms and actual pests. And this frog I actually took the other day, he's in our conservation lab, and he's considered probably a non-pest organism. And while they themselves may not cause direct damage to your collections, it might be a sign that you still have a pest management problem. Maybe his food source, there is an abundance in your collection, and that food source might cause damage to your collection. And other pests that are a concern, microorganisms like mold, insects, rodents, birds, and bats, which can not only cause damage to your objects, but also to your museum structure as a whole. Having an integrated pest management plan in place and having that outlined in your policy can help reduce pest infestation. Next, pollutants and contaminants. And this, I think, sometimes tends to be a bit overlooked because it's not as easy to see to the visible eye, but it can come in many different forms: gases, aerosols, liquids, or solids. And knowing how you can minimize airborne or contact with your collections. This example here in the photo, we have dust covers over the canoes at the museum. So something very basic can help prevent damage. What kind of HVAC system do you have in place? are you using archival supplies in an enclosure in an exhibit? Making sure that those materials aren't off-gassing and creating a chemical reaction with your object. Light. I thought this was a good quote from the Canadian Conservation Institute. It says a balance between seeing collections well today and seeing them, quote, well into the future. And I think that is a really big balance that we have to strike. We have to be able to see our collections, to care for them properly, but also we want to limit the amount of damage that we're causing. And the next two, incorrect temperature, and then I have incorrect relative humidity. Both of these, whether it's too high, too low, or you have fluctuations in both, can cause extreme damage to your collection. And creating strategies and creating guidelines in your policy of how you're going to handle fluctuations or how you're going to monitor your relative humidity and temperature is critical for your for the care of your collections.
Kate, this is Miriam jumping in. Kate, this is Miriam jumping in.
Times when you actually have to do conservation for your collections. So it's important to know when to turn to ask for help and to really seek out the advice of an expert. Okay. And
Well, I'm sorry, Adam Lafacci here, Learning Times moderator jumping in. I just shut off the audio at your location for a moment, just because we would like to take a second just to make sure to clear up the sound issues at all of those locations. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Miriam for a quick moment. I believe she had something she wanted to say on that.
Adam, you and I were doing the same thing. Kate, we wonder if you put a little more distance between your mouth and the microphone. We think people that the quality of the sound would improve. If you could try that, and again, apologies for interrupting you, to see if that improves the quality of the sound. So back to Kate.
thank you. Is that better?
Yes, that is better.
Further away from the microphone. So hopefully that corrects the problem. Let me know if it doesn't, and I'll scooch away a little bit more. All right. So the overarching term of collections management offers additional subcategories that should be addressed within your policy when it comes to collections care. Okay, good. And the first is safe handling, and this kind of goes hand in hand with that agent of deterioration of physical forces. And objects are at their greatest risk when we handle them, and having that proper planning and foresight is important. I've put in my policy and my procedures that I require training for all new staff and volunteers for handling, and I feel like that's definitely helped in preventing accidents from happening and really making sure that we're caring for our collections in the best way possible. Next is inventory, and you'll see that generally inventory has its own category within, or own chapter within your policy. And the reasons why we do inventory are, there's several different reasons, whether it's accountability, updating information. If you're planning or budgeting for the next fiscal year, you're able to expand your collection area. Doing an inventory might be helpful. Condition assessments, and really just establishing control. And it might be important to think about how often are you going to require a full comprehensive inventory of your collection. Do you do it every 5 years, every 10 years? When else might you require an inventory to be completed? Packing and shipping. This may or may not apply to all museums. It really depends on if you loan your objects out to other museums or institutions. But there are several things that should be considered: the value, size, the importance of that object, how you would most likely want to transport that object. Will you require someone to courier that object at all times? And off-site storage. A lot of us have off-site storage because we've run out of space in our current storage areas. But whatever you outline in your policy should also be applicable to your off-site storage location as well. You know, identifying your security, do you have restricted access to those areas? Are there environmental controls? I looked at, you know, one museum where they had a state-of-the-art off-site storage facility, and I worked at another where they used the old carriage house down the road for storage. So regardless of what type of off-site storage you have, you know, putting that in your policy will help for better collections care. And the last area I'd like to speak on briefly for care of collections in museums is caring for culturally sensitive objects. You know, and ask yourself when you're developing your policy, do you hold objects that might fall under this category? Perhaps you have objects that fall under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And that might require you to really set out some guidelines of how you're going to consult with tribes and how you're going to communicate effectively with them. And consultation becomes a really important way for your museum and the tribe to communicate, and not make, you know, only making sure that you're in compliance with the law, but also you're creating this valuable relationship with the outside community in terms of care. And maybe you don't have objects that fall necessarily under NAGPRA but would still be considered culturally sensitive. And it's just important that museums are, you know, willingly enter into discussions with originating communities, whether it is a tribe or not. And that can help with proper care, display, and storage of those objects. And an example, I worked at the Denver Art Museum, and we had an aisle that was designated for a certain type of object. And these objects didn't fall under NAGPRA. But the tribe during consultation had still asked that they be handled a certain way, and that was that only men could handle them, not women. And so it made us be very flexible, and even with the constraints of maybe that request, it was, you know, the museum was still able to take appropriate measures to ensure that all those agreed restrictions were observed. So I just wanted to touch on, you know, culturally sensitive objects, and identifying how your museum will handle those is important, and it can be an important part of your policy, and really ensure that it's this comprehensive and overarching document for collections care. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you very much, Dean. This is Miriam, and I'm wondering if, first off, I want to thank our speakers. We are right back on schedule, I'm pleased to say. I think we all made sure to stay on our time block so we could be back on schedule. So I'm looking around the conference room here, or are there questions from anyone for either Dean or for Kate? We do have a question here, which I'm going to repeat. Dean, it's a question for you, which has to do with cataloging in the library rare materials, so that if it says in the card catalog or the online card catalog that there is a rare material or a rare section in the library, how do you avoid becoming a target for thieves? Do you have any suggestions on how to deal with this?
Well, in my library, what's called the rare book collection is located physically within my archive, and it is under a very strict lockable system that only my staff have keys. So if we have something in the library that we feel, and I will say that if the rare book collection, it also includes things that come into the library setting that are rare, valuable, autographed, early. I mean, our rare book collection starts with Bibles in the 1550s and come forward, and materials autographed and so forth. But within my collection, it's also a West Florida history collection. So even a brand new book today, we would acquire and put it downstairs. But in the library catalog, it will say these things are in the university archives, and a person has to come down and use them. And they have to use them in the room where we have staff and supervision. They can't be checked out of a library. In a museum setting, you may have a little bit more difficulty. You may not have an area where people can look at materials in your collection. You may have to make arrangements with staff or have appointments, or even have a little conference room or something if somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I want to look at certain pottery or certain objects or whatever that they're studying." And by the way, in the library policies in our guidebooks, it says if the item is fragile, if because of the binding, if it's published prior to at least 1870, if it shows autograph, they should be brought to me as the special collections archive person to see whether it's something that we should keep for the collection, as well as whether it should go into the rare book collection.
Dean, the question, Kathleen Kuzik, who is from the Jacksonville Public Library, has a follow-up question. And the follow-up question is, does that then mean that anybody using rare books is accompanied or supervised by someone? And this is Miriam, and I'm going to say if anybody else is in a public library situation where they have figured out a way to handle this, please jump on as well and tell us how you do it.
Most public libraries and even university libraries that really aren't in the rare book collection area, most of them generally will have a small room, maybe a small glassed-in room where someone can look at something. I have talked to libraries that don't have that kind of thing, and the person on reference would fetch the book from the locked area and give it to the person to use in the library. I don't recommend that because that raises questions of security. Another option in a library might be to get another copy of the item, a microfilm copy or a user copy. Again, that comes back to the issue of libraries where it comes back to the question of how things are going to be used. I think in rare book we treat the thing both as rare but also as an intrinsic object in themselves. In other words, the binding, the history of the printing, and that kind of thing. And in a public library setting, it's better that you have an area where you can oversee, or where the person has to look at the area. I have seen public libraries that could create small glass rooms that are visible, say, from the reference desk or something, where a person could use a book in there. Libraries, a lot of public libraries didn't have these kind of rooms many years ago, and people were coming in, they were literally slicing out the woodcut illustrations and selling them on eBay and stuff like that. And that's something that you want to avoid.
Anybody else have specifically public library suggestions to add here before I move us on to the next question? Okay, it's certainly a discussion that can be continued in the online community in the chat box, but I think the body language I'm getting here is that was helpful, so thank you, Dean. The next question that I see, and I think that both Dean and Kate may want to address it, is that for archives, or for that matter, for any collections, is the emergency plan a separate document, or is it an actual part of the collections development policy? And I might add, what are the pros and cons of handling it either way? Kate, do you want to?
In our policy, we address our emergency plan within that document, but it's very broad and basic. And then we do have very detailed procedures that are a separate document within our policy, outside of our policy. And I think the reason for that, or the reason why we've done that, is because Our emergency plan not only incorporates collections, but it also incorporates the museum as a whole, and so that's an aspect of our emergency plan.
This is Dean again. I would say our emergency plan is separate from our collection plan. The only reason I can give you for that is the fact that it really involves a different level of people. In other words, the collection management plan is kind of a plan that's used by people in developing the collection and protecting the collection. In a library, you have people working in acquisition, you have people working in cataloging, you have people working in circulation, and they tend to follow that plan. When it comes down to the emergency plan, that seems to be the people that kind of falls with the people that are actually in charge of that area of the library or that collection. So in our case, it's a separate plan. It's part of our overall library manual, but it's separate from the collection management plan itself.
This is a question for Kate, and Kate, the question is, how do you judge what are culturally sensitive objects? Are there guidelines that you follow? How do you know what's culturally sensitive and what you need to pay attention to?
Okay, thanks, Miriam. I would suggest starting with what's required under the law to identify culturally sensitive objects. NACAR lays it out pretty specifically of what is considered culturally sensitive. And once you do that and you begin consultation with a tribe, you may find that there are other objects that might be considered culturally sensitive that don't necessarily fall under the law. I hope I'm making sense here. And like I said in my presentation, it doesn't necessarily even have to fall under NACAR or be with tribes. If you work in a community-based museum, whether you're working with African objects or you're working with the Jewish community, I think it's important to just open up that communication with people and to invite them to look at objects in their collections. Maybe there are objects that have been identified as religious, and they may not want those objects back, but they may have suggestions on how to store them or how to handle them properly.
Kate, would it be fair to say that if the object involves a human remain or something that you know is involved with funerary rites, that should be a red flag that you should be trying to figure out the appropriate way to handle the object? Is that sort of a first pass, definitely pay attention here?
Yes, absolutely. Under the law, if you have objects in your collections that are human remains, if you have objects that are associated grave goods or grave goods in any kind, or objects of cultural patrimony, used for religious ceremonies or for religious functions, those are kind of those red flag items that should be addressed first and foremost.
Thanks so much, Kate. And I'm going to make sure that everybody who's a little further away from the screen can see Elisa's note, which is in the bottom left, which is that there are, if you're working with objects from countries outside the United States, there are international conventions and regulations that deal with the rights of indigenous people. And so that if you've got collections in those areas, doing a little research and talking with other colleagues with those kinds of collections can help you understand what you have to pay attention to.